Bart Burron, we need to talk about the church accounts.
I'm not sure what you mean. The accounts are all in order. I just balanced them.
Bart Burron volunteered as treasurer of his Ottawa church for 30 years. He was a chartered accountant from the Federal Auditor General's own office, the last person anyone thought to check. No one checked. The records told the whole story.
Church accounts.
I'm not sure what you mean. The accounts are all in order. I just balanced them.
$600,000 moved out of St. Luke's over the last 4 years.
That's incorrect. You're misreading the investment transfers. Those were all authorized by...
4 years of ledgers. 4 years of bank reconciliations. 4 years of monthly treasurer's reports presented to a congregation that trusted every page. $607,000 had walked out of St. Luke Lutheran Church, one quiet entry at a time. The man who built the books was the man who hollowed them out. And when the luxury condos he gambled it all on collapsed, the only thing left was a paper trail. And it led to the only person who had ever held the pen. Quick question before we get into this one. Would you ever expect a chartered accountant who spent his entire career working for the Federal Auditor General to be the one stealing from his own church? Drop your honest answer in the comments. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. We cover the cases the news cycles forget within a week. Bart Burron was born in 1946 in a small Ontario town just outside Ottawa, the second of 3 children in a working-class household. His father drove a delivery truck for a wholesale grocer. His mother kept the books for the family, coupons stapled to envelopes, a tin under the kitchen sink for the gas money. The rent envelope filled the first of every month in cash. From the time he was old enough to count, Bart sat at the kitchen table and watched her balance the household down to the last penny. She told him, more than once, that money was a kind of language. If you could speak it cleanly, no one could lie to you. He believed her. Bart was the kind of student teachers remembered for the wrong reasons. Quiet, polite, never the loudest voice in the room, but always the one who handed in math homework that was inexplicably perfect. By high school, he was tutoring classmates in algebra for 50 cents an hour. His report cards used the same word every term: dependable. By his senior year, his guidance counselor had circled accounting on a career questionnaire and told him there was a place in Ottawa for a young man who could be trusted with numbers. He enrolled at Carleton University in the fall of 1965. He paid his own tuition with summer work at a local hardware store and weekends doing tax returns for neighbors at $30 a return. His professors wrote letters of reference using the exact language his mother had used: methodical, trustworthy, precise. He graduated in 1969 and began the long apprenticeship toward his chartered accountancy designation. He passed his uniform final examination on the first attempt in 1972, something only a fraction of candidates managed. By his mid-20s, the letter CA followed his name on every business card he ever printed. In 1974, he applied for and accepted a position at the Office of the Auditor General of Canada, the federal watchdog whose entire institutional purpose is to audit the books of every department, every crown corporation, and every agency that ever touches a taxpayer's dollar. The job did not pay what private practice would have paid. It did not have to. For Bart, working for the Auditor General was the highest possible expression of what his mother had told him at the kitchen table. The Auditor General was the country's defense against being lied to with numbers. He stayed for the next 38 years. His career file at the Office of the Auditor General read exactly the way you would expect. Performance reviews described him as thorough, above reproach, and an exemplar of the values of the institution. He was promoted 3 times in the first decade, and twice more after that. He led audits of Crown corporations. He helped train junior auditors on the standards of independence and professional skepticism that the profession required. He never missed a deadline. He never had a complaint filed against him. One supervisor wrote in an annual review that his judgment could be relied upon without supervision. Outside the office, the picture was equally settled. In 1971, while still finishing his articling period, Bart married a woman named Elaine, an elementary school teacher he had met at a church social in his last year of university. They bought a modest 2-story brick house in the new Edinburgh neighbourhood of Ottawa. Old trees, narrow lots, families who knew each other's children by name. They had 2 daughters. The girls went to the local public school, took piano lessons on Wednesdays, and went tobogganing on Rockcliffe Hill every winter Bart could be talked into driving. The Burrons were not flashy people. The car in the driveway was a Volvo station wagon that they kept for 14 years. Their vacations were a cabin on the Rideau Lakes, and once a 2-week trip to visit Elaine's relatives in Sweden. They paid down their mortgage steadily. They saved for the girls' university. By every external measure, the Burron household was a portrait of the kind of careful, mid-career Canadian financial life that auditors are paid to admire. And then there was the church. St. Luke Lutheran Church sat 4 blocks from the Burrons' house, in the heart of New Edinburgh. A small red brick congregation with a slate roof, stained glass windows the color of deep summer water, and a tall white spire visible from 3 streets away. Bart and Elaine joined the congregation shortly after they were married. They sat in the 3rd pew from the back. They sent the girls to Sunday school. They brought casseroles to the potlucks and helped string lights on the Christmas tree in the narthex each December. In 1979, the previous treasurer of St. Luke retired after a long illness. The church needed someone with the right training, someone trustworthy, someone willing to do the work without pay. The chair of the board approached Bart after a Sunday service and asked, in the careful, half-apologetic way church boards always ask, whether he would consider stepping in. Bart said yes the same afternoon. He was 33 years old. He would hold the position, without interruption, for the next 30 years. A Lutheran congregation in Canada is not a wealthy institution. St. Luke had, at any given moment, about 220 members on its rolls. Of those, roughly 90 were active enough to attend services with any regularity. Of those, perhaps 60 contributed to the church financially on a meaningful basis. The annual operating budget hovered somewhere between $450,000 and $600,000, depending on the year, the heating bill, and the cost of maintaining a 120-year-old roof. The money came from 3 places. The first was weekly offering, envelopes dropped into a velvet bag on Sunday mornings, mostly checks, sometimes cash, sometimes pre-authorized debits set up by older members who liked to know it was handled. The second was the annual stewardship campaign, pledges committed in the fall, paid out across the calendar year. The third, and easily the most consequential, was the endowment. St. Luke had been founded in the late 19th century. Over the decades, a handful of bequests from older members had been left to the church in their wills, small fortunes by congregational standards, donated by people who had spent their lives quietly accumulating savings and had no children to leave them to. By the time Bart Burron took over as treasurer, the endowment held just over $1 million in invested assets. The interest from those investments paid for roughly a third of the church's operating costs every single year. The endowment was the thing that made St. Luke financially viable. Without it, the congregation would have shrunk into a struggling, hand-to-mouth parish. With it, the church could afford a full-time minister, a part-time organist, a youth coordinator, and the upkeep on a manse, the church-owned residence next door where the minister and his family lived. The treasurer was responsible for managing the endowment. The treasurer was responsible for moving money between the operating account and the endowment account. The treasurer was responsible for preparing the monthly financial report that the board reviewed at its meetings. The treasurer was responsible for the annual report presented to the congregation. The treasurer prepared the books that the volunteer audit committee reviewed once a year, when the board could find two retirees willing to spend a Saturday flipping through bank statements. And the treasurer had sole signing authority on every account the church held. That is the phrase that matters. Sole, signing, authority, no second signature, no co-treasurer, no requirement that two people review a transaction before money left the church's accounts. The bylaws of St. Luke, written in the 1950s and updated only cosmetically since, simply named the treasurer as the authorized signatory and trusted that the rest would take care of itself. This was not unusual for a small Canadian church. It was, in fact, the norm. Volunteer treasurers were difficult to find. Asking two of them to sign every check doubled the inconvenience. The structural assumption, the unspoken theology of it, was that the kind of person who would volunteer to keep a church's books was also the kind of person who would not steal from a church. The role selected for honesty by virtue of being unpaid. Bart Burron stepped into that role in 1979. For the first 30 years he held it, the assumption held. In late 2008, Bart Burron made a decision that no one inside the church would understand until years later. He was 62 years old. He had been at the office of the Auditor General for 34 years. He was within sight of retirement. Elaine had retired from teaching 3 years earlier. Their daughters were grown, one a lawyer in Toronto, the other a pediatrician in Calgary, both with families of their own. The mortgage on the new Edinburgh house had been paid off in 2003. By any reasonable accounting of his life, Bart Burron was comfortable. Not wealthy, comfortable. He wanted more than comfortable. The plan, as it would later be reconstructed in court filings, was a luxury condominium development on the south side of Ottawa. A friend of a friend was a real estate developer with a piece of land, an architect's rendering, and not quite enough capital to break ground. Burron, with his accountant's eye, ran the numbers and concluded that the project would return 4 to 5 times its initial investment within 36 months. The condos would sell. The profit would be substantial. His retirement, instead of being comfortable, would be something closer to wealthy. There was only one obstacle. He did not have the money. What he had was access. The first transaction left St. Luke's accounts in early 2009. It was small, a transfer between the endowment account and what Burron labeled on the church's books as a temporary investment vehicle. The transfer was $40,000. In the monthly financial report Burron presented to the board 3 weeks later, the endowment balance appeared exactly where it should have. The $40,000 had been moved on the bank statement, but on the church's internal ledger, it had been re-described as a holding in a money market instrument the board did not know how to look up. That is the entire scheme, in miniature. Burron did not have to forge outside documents. He did not have to fabricate a fake bank. He was the person who wrote the report the board read. He was the person who maintained the internal ledger. He was the person who reconciled the bank statements to that ledger every month. The reconciliation was the document that, in any normal organization, would have caught the discrepancy. In Burron's case, the reconciliation was a document he produced for himself. The $40,000 left the church and went to the developer. 3 months later, $85,000 more left. then $60,000, then $110,000 in a single transfer in the autumn of 2009. By the end of the first year, more than $240,000 had been quietly removed from the endowment, and the monthly reports Burron presented to the board reflected an endowment balance that was, on paper, almost exactly what it had been a year earlier. The condo project was not progressing as the rendering had promised. The architect's drawings did not match the soil engineering. The municipal approvals were slower than projected. Costs ran over. The developer needed more. Burron, having already begun, kept going. In 2010, another $140,000 left the church. In 2011, $125,000. The descriptions in the internal ledger became more elaborate. Burron began listing fictitious investment products by name, a bond fund here, a guaranteed income certificate there, all of them assigned account numbers that, if anyone had bothered to look them up, did not exist. He prepared annual reports for the congregation that showed the endowment growing modestly, year over year, in line with what the markets had done. The numbers were entirely invented. They were also entirely plausible. The audit committee, 2 volunteers, neither of them an accountant, both of them well into their 70s, reviewed the books once a year. They opened the binder Burron had prepared. They flipped through the statements. They looked at the totals. They saw the signature of a chartered accountant from the office of the Auditor General at the bottom of the report. They signed off. By 2012, Burron had transferred more than $500,000 from the church to the condo project. The condos were 3/4 built. Burron told the developer, and told himself, that the moment the first unit sold, the money would flow back into the church accounts in a single corrective transaction. The endowment would be whole. No one would ever know. The 4 years of falsified ledgers would be replaced by a clean set of books going forward. In 2013, a final transfer of approximately $70,000 left the church. The running total stood at $607,000, and then the condos did not sell. The market for high-end Ottawa condominiums in 2013 was not the market the developer had projected 3 years earlier. Inventory was sitting. Listings were being cut. The few units that sold were sold at prices well below the cost of construction. The project, far from returning 4 to 5 times its investment, was now bleeding equity at a rate that no further injection of capital could fix. The developer, increasingly desperate, asked Burron for more. Burron, by his own later admission, considered it. The endowment had room. The board would not notice. He had not been caught after 4 years. He could absorb another year without scrutiny. He stopped. The reporting does not record exactly why. Perhaps he understood, finally, what he was about to become. Perhaps he calculated that another transfer would not save the project. Perhaps something in the 38 years he had spent inside the Auditor General's office finally caught up with him. But the money he had already taken was gone. And the project that was supposed to return, it was finished. He continued to prepare monthly reports for the board. He continued to sit in the 3rd pew from the back. He continued to accept the quiet thanks of the chair of the board each year when the annual financial report was tabled. He had no way to put the money back. He had no plan beyond hoping no one would ever look. For 2 more years, no one did. The reporting on Burron's case is not specific about the precise moment the fraud was discovered. The court record does not name the exact triggering event. What the court record does say, in the words of Justice Matthew Weber at sentencing, is that the discovery was made, and that without it, Burron would have kept going. What the broader record makes clear is the structure of the discovery. In a small Lutheran congregation, fraud at this scale does not announce itself with a dramatic confrontation. It begins as a small unease. Somewhere in 2014 or early 2015, by the best reconstruction, a question was asked about the endowment that Burron could not fully answer. A board member, looking at the annual report, asked for a specific brokerage statement for one of the holdings Burron had listed. Burron, who had invented the holding, produced a vague substitute. The board member, not satisfied, asked again. The substitute did not match the first explanation. A second board member, an accountant by training, became involved. The board did what boards do when something does not feel right. They asked for the underlying documentation, not the monthly report Burron had prepared, the actual brokerage statements, the actual bank statements, the actual confirmations from the actual institutions where the endowment was supposedly held. Burron could produce the bank statements. He could not produce the brokerage statements because the brokerage holdings did not exist. He bought time. He claimed the statements were with his personal records at home. He said he would bring them next week. He brought a document that was not a statement. He apologized for the confusion. He promised to clarify. The board, increasingly alarmed, began comparing the bank statements they had now obtained directly from the church's financial institution to the monthly reports Burron had presented over the previous several years. The reconciliation did not reconcile. The endowment on the bank's records was several $100,000 smaller than the endowment on the church's internal books. The gap had been growing for years. Once the board had the two columns side by side, the size of the hole was undeniable. The board went to the police. The Ottawa Police Service Financial Crimes Unit took the file. They did not need to do exotic work. The documents Burron himself had produced over 4 years were the documents that proved the fraud. The internal ledger he had maintained, when laid alongside the bank's own records, told the entire story in 2 columns. Money that had been listed as invested had, in fact, been wired out. The fictional investment account numbers did not correspond to any real institution. The signature on every outgoing transfer was the same single signature: Bart Burron, treasurer, sole signing authority. The investigators interviewed the developer. The developer by then had filed for personal bankruptcy. The condo project had been sold off in pieces for less than the cost of the land. The developer cooperated. He produced records of every transfer he had received from Burron. The amounts matched, dollar for dollar, the amounts that had left the church. Burron, for his part, did not run. He did not try to flee the country. He did not, by all accounts, even particularly try to deny what had happened once the police arrived. The case did not require a confession. The books were the confession. He had built the evidence himself, one monthly report at a time, for 4 years. We're heading into the part of this story where the books finally got opened by someone other than the man who wrote them. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel is different. Subscribe and stick with me. The consequences in this one will sit with you for a long time. The forensic accountants brought in by the Crown spent months reconstructing what Burron had done. The work was not glamorous. It was, in fact, the same work Burron had spent his career doing inside the office of the Auditor General. Line by line, transaction by transaction, comparing one document to another and writing down where they did not agree. What they found, when they finished, was a portrait of the fraud in clinical detail. Between 2009 and 2013, exactly 14 separate transfers had left the church's accounts and arrived in the accounts of the condo developer. The smallest was $32,000. The largest was $142,000. The transfers were not regular. They were timed to coincide with construction milestones the developer needed to meet. Burron had been responsive to the project's cash flow demands, the way a chief financial officer would have been responsive to a corporate budget. The total was $607,342. Inside the church's books, every one of those transfers had been disguised. Some had been described as new investment purchases. Others had been described as transfers between two accounts the church did not actually hold. One particularly bold entry, from the fall of 2011, had been described in the ledger as a rebalancing of the endowment portfolio, a phrase that meant nothing in particular but sounded plausible to anyone who was not an accountant. The board, by the time the forensic accountants delivered their final report, had already begun to confront the second half of the problem. The money was gone. The condo project had collapsed. The developer was bankrupt. Whatever the criminal process produced, the church itself was in immediate financial trouble. The endowment, which had paid for roughly a third of the operating budget each year, was a fraction of what the books had claimed. The interest income disappeared overnight. The annual budget, which had appeared to balance for years, suddenly did not. The board did the only thing it could do. It put the manse, the church-owned house next door, where the minister had lived for 25 years, on the market. Reverend Bryan King had lived in that manse since 1990. He had raised his children in it. He had buried both of his parents while living in it. The house was, by every measure, short of legal title, his home. The sale was the only way the church could remain solvent. The civil side of the case moved alongside the criminal one. Lawyers acting for the church pursued every asset Burron had. The civil settlement returned approximately $117,000, most of it from the equity in the Burron family home, which had to be sold. Elaine Burron, who had taught third grade in Ottawa for 31 years, moved with her husband out of the brick house in New Edinburgh and into a small rented apartment closer to Vanier. The two daughters, by all accounts, did not know any of this was happening until the day they did. The remainder, about $454,000, was the figure that would follow Burron into the criminal sentencing. The Crown filed its charge in 2018. The single count was fraud over $5,000, contrary to Section 380 of the Criminal Code of Canada. The supporting evidence was a binder more than 400 pages long, composed almost entirely of documents Burron himself had created. The confrontation in this case did not happen in a parking lot, or a hallway, or a hotel room. There was no body cam footage of an arrest, no breathless dispatch call. It happened in a small upstairs room of St. Luke Lutheran Church after a board meeting that ran past 10 at night. The board chair, Pierre Cornier, asked Burron to stay back. The outside accountant, who had been quietly reviewing the documentation for the previous 6 weeks, was already in the room. So was the previous Sunday's bulletin, folded on the table beside a stack of bank statements. The exchange, as later reconstructed from the participants, was brief. Cornier laid 2 pieces of paper on the table in front of Burron. The first was the church's internal endowment ledger, prepared by Burron for the previous fiscal year. The second was a printout from the bank, obtained directly for the same period. The numbers did not match. They had not matched for years. "Bart, we need you to explain this." Burron looked at the 2 pages. He did not look at the people sitting around the table. He did not, in the account that survives, ask a single question. He did not feign surprise. He did not pretend to misunderstand. "I can't." The accountant in the room pressed gently. The bank statements showed transfers out of the endowment account that the internal ledger did not show. There were many of them. They totaled, on the running tally the accountant had been keeping, more than $500,000. "Where did the money go, Bart?" Burron, for a long time, said nothing. "Bart, where is the money?" "It's gone." The room went quiet. "It went into a condo project. The project failed. The money is gone." He did not cry. He did not apologize. He sat at the table, his hands folded in front of him, and he looked at the wall behind Pierre Cornier's left shoulder. When Cornier asked him whether he understood that the church would have to go to the police, Burron nodded once. The meeting ended. Burron walked out of the church and drove home. He told Elaine, that night, what he had done. He had no other words. In the years between that night and his sentencing, he would never publicly speak a single one of remorse. The fraud trial of Bart Burron, age 73, was held in the Ontario Court of Justice in Ottawa. In April 2019, more than a decade after the first transfer had left St. Luke's accounts, a judge convicted him of fraud over $5,000. The conviction was not contested. The evidence, the church's own books, did not permit a contest. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for October 4th, 2019. It was, by every account of those who attended, a small and quiet proceeding. Burron sat in a charcoal suit. Elaine sat in the public gallery, 3 rows behind him. The members of the congregation who had chosen to attend, perhaps a dozen of them, sat together on one side of the gallery. The 2 victim impact statements were read aloud by the people who had written them. Reverend Bryan King spoke first. He had lost the manse. He had spent 25 years inside its walls. His statement, by those who heard it, was measured. He did not lash out. He did not raise his voice. He named the loss in simple terms: the home, the years, the trust. And then he named something else. He said it was difficult to forgive a man who had not asked for forgiveness. He said, in the words that would be quoted in the next morning's papers, that watching Burron be sentenced was very difficult. Not because the sentence was severe, because the sentence did not undo any of what had been done. A faith built on forgiveness and reconciliation, he said, had been handed a problem it did not know how to solve. Because the man at the center of it had never asked to be forgiven and never offered anything to be reconciled with. Pierre Cornier, the chair of the board, spoke second. His statement was the colder of the 2, not angry, but exact. He described the structural failure, the sole signing authority, the unaudited reports, the implicit trust in a chartered accountant from the office of the Auditor General. He described what the church had done to correct it: a new investment oversight committee, a hired professional accountant, a hired bookkeeper, a requirement written into the bylaws that every check the church wrote bear at least 2 signatures. Each of these, he noted, was a direct correction of a specific point at which Burron had been left alone with the church's money. Burron made no statement. His lawyer made one on his behalf, a brief plea for leniency, citing the accused's age, his lack of prior criminal record, his decades of professional service, and the fact that he had begun to make restitution. Justice Matthew Weber delivered the sentence in language that, by the standards of Canadian sentencing remarks, was not harsh. It was, however, precise. The judge observed that the accused had occupied a position of profound trust. He observed that the position had been earned over 30 years of faithful volunteer service. He observed that the accused was, by profession, an auditor, and that this was the very profession the public relied upon to prevent the kind of conduct the court was now sentencing him for. He observed that the fraud had not stopped because the accused had repented. It had stopped because the accused had been caught. Without the discovery, the judge said, he believed the accused would have continued. The sentence was 2 years in federal prison, 3 years of probation to follow, restitution of $1,000 per month during the probation period. The civil case had already recovered approximately $117,000. The balance owing to the church stood at roughly $454,000. At the end of his remarks, the judge said something that the reporters present made sure to write down. He said that at $1,000 per month, on a fixed retirement income, Bart Burron would likely be in debt to St. Luke Lutheran Church for the rest of his life. Burron stood. He was taken into custody. He served his sentence at a minimum security federal institution in eastern Ontario. He was released to begin his 3 years of probation. He moved back into the small rented apartment where Elaine had been waiting for him. The Reverend's manse, sold to keep the church solvent, became someone else's home. The new oversight committee at St. Luke met for the first time within months of the discovery and has met regularly ever since. The bookkeeper hired to maintain the books does not have signing authority on any account. The professional accountant hired to review the books does not prepare them. The bylaws now require multiple signatures on every check. Each of those corrections is a small tombstone for the system that allowed a single trusted man to take $600,000, one quiet entry at a time. St. Luke survived. The congregation is still there. The third pew from the back, where Bart and Elaine Burron sat together for nearly 40 years, has been filled over the years since by other families who do not know its history. The annual financial report is still presented every spring at the congregational meeting. It is just a much shorter document now with a much smaller number on the endowment line. Reverend Bryan King said the hardest part in the end was not the money. The hardest part was that a faith built on forgiveness had been handed a man who had never asked for any. The debt the judge described, financial, moral, and spiritual, was a debt that no 2-year sentence could close. This case was quiet, but this next case on the right-hand side might be the loudest betrayal of trust this channel has ever covered. Click it now